Right, so this next lecture really focuses on the U.S. Constitution, how it developed, and the important elements that we should know about it. All right, and so as we mentioned in the last lecture, the Articles of Confederation were not effective. Right. In addition to that, there was high debt. The states all had different debts in the Revolutionary War. There was no way to pay back that debt because the national government could not levy taxes. And so there was a lot of issues going on, right? And the high debt on individuals, in particular, farmers in Massachusetts, led to what's known as Shays' Rebellion, right? Kind of an uprising of farmers that ended in the death of a few farmers. But it really highlighted the need for change. It kind of helped propel more states to kind of accept this, right? Because originally, in 1786, the year before the Constitutional Convention, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, James Madison's from Virginia, Hamilton's from New York. You can actually go visit his grave today if you want in Trinity Church right off of Wall Street. But anyway, these two in particular are the leading figures calling for a convention to kind of address the shortcomings of this Articles of Confederation. And the first convention is actually held in Annapolis, Maryland, but very few states show up. I think only 5 states end up sending delegates or representatives. But they at least agree to call for a new convention next year, the following year, to discuss trade and other important issues um, that are going on in the country. Shays' Rebellion and other instances um, convinced 12 of the 13 states to send representatives, to send delegates. The one lone exception is Rhode Island, who chooses originally not to send a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. All right, let's take a minute to read this quote by George Washington, right, written to James Madison, kind of in the lead up to the Constitutional Convention. Um, and what he's saying is really wrong with the Articles of Confederation. What's the main issue with it? Take a minute, think about it, and then when you're ready, hit resume. And he's really saying that these 13 sovereignties, right, which sovereignty is really usually that word is used to describe independent countries, um, are pulling against each other, right? They're divided. And all this tugging at the federal head, at the national head, the national government, will lead to the whole collapse, right? And why that's so important, why it's important not to let this collapse happen, is because it's threatening our lives, liberty, and property, right? The three basic natural rights from the Enlightenment, right, from John Locke, who talks about these things, right, and the need to make sure everyone has them, these natural rights, right? And if we want these natural rights to happen, the Republican experiment happening in the United States needs to be successful. And so, with that in mind, with Shays' Rebellion and other things, 12 states in 1787, May of 1787, send delegates to the Constitutional Convention. The general consensus at this convention is that they need to strengthen the central government. They all kind of accept that, even though there's issues about how to do that and what role the central government should play. They all agree that it needs to be stronger. So this is the system we call federalism. Is kind of what comes out of the Constitutional Convention. This is a really important phrase, important term. We should know and understand what this means. Right? It's like when a government which shares and divides power between a national, which we now call the federal government, and state governments. Right? So this division of power, where the state governments have some legitimate authority and power, but there's also a strong national government to kind of keep everyone unified. Right? Usually, federal systems provide a written constitution, which kind of explains which power belongs to which. Right? If you're going to have the system, it needs to be clear who's in charge of what. The Constitution is highly influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers, people that should sound familiar to you, like John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu, who in France wrote about checks and balances and separation of powers. That comes through in the Constitution because the powers of the government are separated into three branches: the legislative branch, which makes the laws; the executive branch, which enforces the laws; and the judicial branch, which decides if the laws passed and enforced are actually allowed to exist, right? If they actually are allowed under the Constitution, right? And so those are three important branches, right? Instead of keeping all that power in one person, which is really what happens in monarchies or dictatorships, it's divided among several people in several different branches, right? That way, no one branch becomes too powerful and takes control and harms those three natural rights, right? Life, liberty, and property. So Locke, right, these natural rights, property rights are really important and are clearly evident throughout the Constitution. And one of the main goals of the Constitution is to protect property rights and to value those who own property. You also have the Bill of Rights, which eventually comes through during the ratification process. That's important and protects some of these natural rights, like freedom of speech, freedom to worship as you please, so on and so forth. So you have checks and balances, right? This graphic from the textbook really helps kind of visualize that. And so I won't go through each one of these things, right? But checks and balances means that each branch doesn't have complete control over the duties and responsibilities of that branch, right? So, for example, um, the president, right, the executive branch is allowed to appoint federal judges, allowed to appoint judges to the Supreme Court, right? If they had all the power to do that, right, they could appoint whoever they wanted, no matter how corrupt they were, right? And so the check or the balance to that is that yes, the president is the only one who can advance someone for the position, nominate someone for the position, but it's up to the legislative branch, it's up to the Senate to approve that position, right? And so this is happening right now with President Trump's decision to nominate Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, right? And there's a debate now whether he should be doing that now or should he wait till after the election. But still, it's not up to him, right? He nominated the person, but now it's up to the Senate to vote and approve her to the office of Supreme Court Justice. Right? There's plenty of other examples here, so you should take some time to look over these and kind of understand some of these ways that there's checks and balances to the different powers of the different branches of the national government. And when you have so many different groups of people from different states with different interests, right? You have the New England and Mid-Atlantic states who are slightly more industrial, more manufacturing based. You have the southern economies, right? The southern states who are more based on farming and agriculture and slavery, right? You have different religious groups. You have different people with different political ideas. And so in order for this to be successful, there needs to be compromise, right? There needs to be agreement that there will be some sort of surrendering of what you want in order to get some other things, right? And so there's lots of compromising in the Constitution. All are necessary to get the Constitution to pass, right? So in hindsight, we can always judge some of these compromises as wrong, and they were wrong, right? Some of them, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you still have to keep in mind, right, that the bigger picture is they wanted to create a country that would preserve life, liberty, and property. And while not all lives or property or liberty was protected right away, it does set the framework for that to happen, right? So while not perfect, the Constitution was pretty impressive and pretty radical for its time, right? The major issue, one of the largest issues about creating the Constitution was representation in the legislative branch, which we call Congress, right? How should it be decided, right? That's the main debate. Large states like New York and Virginia wanted representation to be based on population. Think about that for a second. Why do you think states like New York wanted representation to be based on population? Because if it's based on representation, based on population, I mean, places like New York will have more representatives in Congress, right? They'll have more power, more influence in Congress, right? So they want it that way. On the flip side, small states like Connecticut and Rhode Island, who don't have large populations, wanted equal representation, like they had under the Articles of Confederation. Think about why they would want that. Right? They'd want that because they would be fearful that if it's only based on population, that they would lose power and influence, right? Under the Articles of Confederation, Connecticut and Rhode Island have kind of oversized power, right? One of them could veto and prevent something from happening, even though they make up a small fraction of the nation's population. Right? So this was the major debate that took a good chunk of time to kind of sort out. Eventually, the compromise that's put forth is put forth by a delegate from Connecticut, a man named Roger Sherman. That's actually why, if you ever look at the license plates for Connecticut, it says the Constitution State, right? Because they're one of the main reasons that the Constitution was advanced. And he puts forth the Connecticut Plan, which is also known as the Great Compromise. And this decided that there'd be two houses in the legislative branch, right? There'd be a Senate, which every state in the Union would receive equal representation. So that's why every state in our country today has 2 senators, right? So there's 100 senators now, currently. They're elected every 6 years. So they serve for longer terms. They were originally chosen by the state legislative, so they were not popularly elected, right? So New York's Legislative Assembly would decide who they wanted to be their 2 senators, and they'd get sent, right? And the reason for that is because this is a way to keep the power, not just power based on the people, but power based on the states as a collective, right? And so this allowed that to happen. The other branch of the Congress, right, of the legislative house, is the House of Representatives. And this house represents representation based on population. So this was a way to appeal to states like New York and Virginia, who had very large populations compared to the other states. They're elected much more frequently, every 2 years. and they're elected popularly, right? So anyone who is eligible to vote would vote for their candidate, their preferred candidate. Um, they're elected more frequently, right? Because if it's based on popular vote, right, popular opinion, popular sentiment changes over time. So it's kind of meant to be more um, fluid. Whereas the Senate was supposed to be kind of more steady, kind of keeping a steady and a more level-headed approach to governing, right? By keeping them in for longer, they had more experience. They weren't kind of up to the will of the people as often, right? So those are important differences between these two branches, these two houses of Congress. Another really important debate they had was who's going to count towards representation, right? Uh, how do we decide how many people should be represented or should be counted when deciding representatives for places like New York, Virginia, and North Carolina? Population in the based on the Constitution affects representation and it affects taxation, right? Levels of taxes, different states, and things so on and so forth. The Southern delegates, places from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia predominantly, um, wanted to count enslaved Africans towards representation. Not because they wanted them to have any influence or power, but they wanted them because they would increase their representation, right? So if suddenly you count slaves, um, now North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia will have more people in Congress than places like Maryland, Vermont, New York, right? Not Vermont, sorry, New Hampshire or New York. Um, which is tricky, right? Because on the one hand, they want them to count as people, but on the other hand, they don't want them. They want them to count them as people, but they don't want to give them any rights, right? They want to treat them like property, but they also don't want to be taxed on this property like they could be. And so there's this real kind of tension between, well, what should we consider these African Americans, right? They should be considered people, but there was a debate about property and people. Um, and the northern states did not want to count these enslaved Africans, right? Because they didn't have many enslaved Africans. By this point, a large concentration of slaves are in the South, and so this would negatively affect the northern states. They did not necessarily care about the righteousness of slavery, but they wanted representation to be more equal based on the people who mattered. And I'm saying that in quotes, right? I don't really actually mean that, but that's kind of how they saw it. Um, the compromise is the three-fifths compromise, right? Arguably the most notorious part of the Constitution in our present context because it did not count enslaved Africans as full people, right? So three-fifths of the total population, for every 5 slaves, 3 of them would count towards representation and taxation purposes. So it was a way of giving the southern states some more influence, right? Probably more influence than they rightfully should have at this point, but not making it completely overpowering for the northern states, right? This gives them the southern states advantages in representation in Congress for a long time in the decades leading up to the Civil War, so about 80 years or so. Eventually, it takes the Civil War to stop this. The interesting thing, though, about slavery, and I always find this so interesting, is that people like Jefferson and Washington and Madison, who owned slaves, they were slave owners, um, wrote extensively about how wrong slavery was, right? They did not, on a theoretical level, or philosophical level, support slavery, but I guess sometimes money speaks louder than words or ideas, right? And so the value of giving up those slaves was too much, right, for these people. So while they are imperfect people for sure, they were on the path towards dealing with and addressing slavery. It takes a long time, but it does happen eventually. Right? And so this is kind of reiterating some things I just mentioned here. Um, right? So these people who wrote the Constitution opposed it theoretically, but still allowed it to happen. Um, the slave owners feared giving the federal government too much power to regulate international trade, right? If the government had power over trade, then what would happen to the slave trade, right? And there was clear voices in the North and in parts of the South, less in the South, but mostly in the North, right? That slave trade was wrong, right? Slavery was wrong, and that it should end. And there was a lot of debate over that. And a lot of people, including Madison and arguably Jefferson and Washington, were okay with getting rid of the slave trade, not necessarily slavery, but stopping the trade in slaves. But this compromise reached was that the federal government would not interfere. They would have power to regulate trade, but they would not interfere with slavery. They would put a moratorium on it for 20 years, right? So they could do nothing about slavery and the importation of slaves until at least 1807, right? Which is good and bad in certain ways, right? But nothing really happens in 1807. It takes longer for the slave trade to be banned, and then even longer for slavery to be abolished. Right? And those two different things we'll talk more about when we talk about slavery. Right? And so I want you guys to take a minute, pause the video, and think about this question. How should we view the Founding Fathers' decision to maintain slavery by putting a 20-year gap prevention on interfering with it? Right? It's bad because it shows the continued acceptance of inhuman practices, right? Forcing people to do what you want and making people property is wrong. And many people, even back then, recognized that. On the other hand, you can argue they were on the right track, right? Because at least this is an improvement over the Articles of Confederation. It gives the government the technical or theoretical authority to eventually do away with it. Right? They do have that power after a certain amount of time, right? So that is an improvement. It is a step in the right direction. It might be frustrating for us today to think that it took so long to do it, but the Constitution itself did allow for the possibility for slavery to be abolished, right? So that's really an important thing to keep in mind. While not perfect, it is a step in the right direction. Another major debate was how to elect the president, right? Again, this debate over popular will versus states' powers, right? And so the compromise was what we call the Electoral College, which you might hear a lot about in the news today. The last presidential election, President Trump won the Electoral College without winning the popular vote, and so many people advocate for the abolishment and getting rid of the Electoral College. But this is how the Electoral College works, right? People elect people we call electors who cast their votes for their preferred candidates, right? And then so if you wanted, say, President Washington to be elected, you would vote for the people who supported President Washington. You would vote for the people who were part of his party, right? That were these electors, and then they in turn would cast their ballots for that person. How it's comprised is each state is given the number of electors that are equal to the number of members in the House of Representatives and the number of senators. So we in New York have about, I want to say, 27 electoral votes on the larger side, one of the largest states, and that's because we have 2 senators. If that number is right, we have 2 senators and then 25 members of the House of Representatives, right? And that's how that number comes to be. There's a lot of debate about the Electoral College, and we'll talk more about it in class. Right? Another important compromise to the Constitution is recognizing that there could be possible shortcomings in the Constitution, or that changing circumstances might require changes to the document. And so the amendment process was created, right? And so in the amendment process, to change or to amend, right? Amend means to change or to fix the Constitution. First, 2/3 of both houses of Congress need to vote for an amendment. So they put forth an amendment that they vote for. And if 2/3 of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the Senate agree to it, it then goes to the states, right? And each state, which kind of is freedom to based on the states for how they want this to happen, but 3/4 or 75% of the states then need to ratify or vote to approve this amendment, right? So it's a lot of steps. It's done that way on purpose, right? Because you don't want constant changes to the Constitution, but it's important that if something is clearly the will of the people by basing 3/4 of the states, right? That's and 2/3 of the elected representatives. That's a lot of people to want to change, right? Currently, we have 27 amendments, and we'll talk more about the amendment process as we go through history and look at some of those different specific amendments. Another important aspect of the Constitution, which has been used in recent years to kind of increase the power of the federal government, is what we call the Necessary and Proper Clause, also known as the Elastic Clause. And so this gives the federal government the power to make, quote, to make all laws which are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the powers of the government. Right? So if the government has the right to tax, they have the right to make any law necessary to get those taxes to happen. Right? And so this law helps to expand, like elastic expands, right, the powers of the government. We're going to stop there, and I'll make another video about the ratification process and what happens, because I don't want this to be too long.